Welcome back, graph enthusiasts, to graphstuff.fm, a podcast all about graphs and graph related technologies. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, and joining us today are all of us tech advocates at Neo4j. ABK,
Hello.
Allison Cassette,
Hello.
and Jason Koo.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we are going to be recapping 2024. We did one of these episodes last year for 2023, and so we thought we would close out 2024 with the same idea by recapping everything that has happened this year, which actually turned out to be a huge task for all of us to come up with what actually has happened this year. It's been kind of a long and short year, we feel like. Does anybody have any thoughts they want to start with on that?
I feel like we should start with GenAI and GraphRag because that has, been I think, the big shift and the big driver over the year.
Yeah.
Right. Because it was something that, GenAI and retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, came up really strong at the end of last year. And we came into this year like running, right? We immediately started working on example use cases for using RAG systems with graphs, and really kind of helping our own community get familiar with the space, right? Because we ourselves like kind of predicted like, okay, vectors are amazing, they're great, but they're going to hit a cliff, right? They're going to hit a cap. And the only thing that makes sense after that is to leverage knowledge graphs, right? So how do we kind of jumpstart or get people familiar with this inevitability, right?
Yeah, as we chatted about in the last episode. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, Jason. And I think one of the interesting challenges of this year, and I'll contrast it to last year, where everyone kind of had some idea like, okay, GenAI seems like it's a thing, but no one is really doing anything yet. But like between folks like us who are trying to figure out what to do with it, and then also businesses who are trying to figure out what to do with it, everyone had on their agenda for this year, okay, do something about GenAI. And for businesses, maybe it was okay, let's put aside some budget for proof of concept or something like that. And then obviously for us, we're like, okay, step one, how to do RAG at all. And then very quickly, as soon as you do that, take that first step, it like, okay, that's cool. Then you take another step and another step, and now it goes down an entire rabbit hole of possibilities. And still, I think fair to say, like this year, nevertheless, was still in exploring what is possible, as relentlessly every week, every day, maybe sometimes, but like at least every week, there's new papers coming out, new solutions coming out, new LLM models coming out on kind of the entire stack of things that are possible, from end user, kind of consumer level, I guess, stuff I'd say, all the way down to the research papers. The entire thing was just like relentlessly moving forward through the whole year. And so while we're simultaneously trying to like, just define and describe and help people learn how to do things with what's available now, the now is shifting sand the entire year.
Yeah.
I really felt that this year as well, that things moved so quickly and so fast. There were new things available or new strengths and weaknesses, or people would start using it for this or that, and the ground would shift or the momentum would shift into some other thing, and something else would kind of take the lead for a while and then it'd shift again. And so things became really out of date really quickly. And just the amount of ground I think that the whole space has covered this year has been huge.
Agreed. I mean, there was a talk I was giving at the end of last year called Beyond Vectors, right? And the entire year was about Beyond Vector, right? It was all about, okay, like nice starting point, but let's actually get into it. So it's just really interesting for me even to look at the talks that I was giving a year ago versus where we are now, where now you go to graphrag.com and you have everything about what's beyond the vector, everything about graph and how you leverage it and where it fits into your space and how to understand it. I think the community in general and, ABK, we're gonna shout out to you here and all the work that you've done on this year, is being able to have a resource like that at the end of the year when we were barely talking about it this time last year is just a testament to what everyone's saying of how quickly it's moving and, how much it's grown and where it's even going to go.
To follow up on that too, I did notice I had one presentation that I gave a few different times this year. And every time I came back to it to prep it for the next event presentation, I modified quite a bit of it because things had changed so much. And I felt like the groundwork or the
Yeah.
backdrop setup for people to understand what was going on and how to get to building something with RAG had changed so much. Having to kind of reorient at least the first part of my presentation every time was a little bit unsettling to me, but also kind of fun because it was never the same presentation twice.
Yeah.
Drawing attention to beginning of the year to now, one of the challenges that we encountered very early on in terms of building these initial graph rag sort of prototypes was we kept encountering like, oh, getting data prepped and ingested for a graph system was repeatedly a challenge, right? It was a great roadblock to, I think, getting other folks to start. And out of that sort of like shared knowledge and frustration, the LLM graph builder emerged, right? Like, okay, we just need a quick way to get people's own personal data rather than curated data sets that we had done in the past to quickly choose, some URLs or PDFs, whatever your data source is, and quickly get to the point of, this is what the end data of a graph rag system is going to look like. Even if initially it's, if you don't give the graph builder some constraints, right? An LLM is going to create way too many entities and relationships. But if you don't know how to start, that becomes actually a great starting point, right? Oh, okay. These are the types of entities and relationships that kind of appear most in my data set. I can run this thing again with this constraint and get a kind of a cleaner data set. And that, in looking in retrospect, that was basically a year-long adventure, learning curve of like, oh yes, this is kind of the easiest way to kind of show someone to get started without spending a huge amount of prep time.
It's funny looking back at it's funny looking back at all the things that maybe seem funny now, taking an entire year to get the hang of or to catch up on. Sorry, ABK, go ahead.
No, I agree with you. I think actually I was going to reflect on that point a little bit, that from a year ago till now, the things that we now assume to already know were hard earned. Like, it was new ideas that we had to figure out and test out, and having gotten past them, now to us they seem like simple and obvious. They were not simple and obvious a year ago, right?
Yeah.
But now we're like, oh, obviously this is what you should do. You should chunk up your data in this way. You should do a linked list. You should do the summarization. All the things that we do
Mhm.
that are kind of baked into the tool, as you say, Jason. The LLM Graph Builder tool did a great job of condensing all that into like one operation. But without that, it's like, okay, I kind of understand what you're saying, but it seems like a lot of work, and I don't really understand what the point of all that work is. We know, and I'll say even kind of past that, I'll reference about a month ago we had this event we called the GenAI Graph Gathering, where we got together kind of cross organizations between Neo4j and folks at Google, folks at Meta, folks at all kinds of places that are like at the leading edge of doing stuff in RAG and graphs and GenAI. We got about 30 people in a room together, spent the day together. Basically, it's a bunch of engineers in a room together sharing notes, because we're all trying to push the envelope. We're like, okay, we're going to go off and like build products and all that kind of stuff is going to happen. But there's a baseline we all want to be able to just accelerate and agree upon together, that any kind of collaboration we can do on things that are common are going to help us all then in the differentiated kind of things we're going to do, right? And like one of the comments I ended up repeating on that day was, okay, let's all just keep in mind, everybody here in this room is living in Tomorrowland. Outside of this room, nobody has any idea what the hell we're talking about, right? That we're so deep into this that the things we assume that we have learned, hard-earned learning over the last year, it takes time for people to get up to that, particularly if, for some people, and I'm one of those people actually, a year ago, I would not say that I program in Python. I will say it now, but not in a very strong way. Like, I can code in Python. I don't think I'm a Pythonista, but there's a lot of people who are like that. Like when we did our developer survey, that showed up that lots of people learned Python so they could do GenAI. So kind of collectively, we ourselves, the other folks that we work with, our customers, and then certainly, I think everyone kind of in the tech industry, this was just a giant year of learning. I think is probably one of the takeaways for me.
The other thing that was exciting about this year is I don't know that in my lifetime there's ever been a moment, at least for me, where we're part of actively creating the standards for how people are going to do things in the future. Right? I mean, certainly there have been moments, the cloud moment and the big data moment and these other types of moments where I talked to people in industry who were in those rooms at that time. And it's just exciting for me to have us be in one of those moments right now where, like you said, at the graph gathering or, what's coming out now about retrieval patterns, being at the moment of definition, it's super exciting.
Speaking of standards, the graph query language, right? GQL came out earlier this year. And so I was trying to look up, I forget what part of that spec includes an extension to SQL to allow it to better query graphs. I can't remember the name extension of it, but when you look at it, it's interesting, right? Because it's basically
PGX.
a mix. PGX? Okay. It's basically a mix of SQL and what looks like Cypher, right? And so you're using Cypher-esque syntax to do the pattern matching that you would normally do in a graph data store. So yes, anyways, that thought I'd riff off of standards.
Yeah, to kind of talk a little bit more about the GQL release. I guess that went live in April, so it is officially out. And there's some work being done to migrate and incorporate some of the things that came out of that into various query languages, Cypher being included in that. So for anyone interested, check out the links and sources for that.
Yeah, and definitely be mindful that it's going to take the industry some time for everyone to kind of be on the same page, right? So right now, I don't believe you can query both in GQL and Cypher for like Neo4j, right? It's still going to be Cypher. Cypher is still being updated to also include GQL features. And I believe down the road, at some point, either we or a community driver will come out so that you could query Neo4j using GQL. But this is probably going to be the same for everyone in this part of the industry. It's going to take a bit of time before you get to that point.
Yeah, I think in the interim, as you're saying, there'll be a bit of a mix, across anybody who's supporting the language, where there'll be different levels of conformance, like how much of the spec like you actually support. Everyone is going to have the basics. There'll be pattern matching. We could probably check that box off. If you don't have pattern matching, I don't know what you're doing. You're not doing graph stuff. So there's at least going to be that. But then there'll be subtle things like keywords that are basically aliases for what Cypher today uses that are functionally the same in GQL, but they just pick different words. So you'll be able to use, I think, either word. Like if you're using Cypher, for instance, you can use either one. It'll be just fine. And as I understand, like some of the plan for Neo4j would be that the Cypher interpreter itself will basically have things. Eventually, it'll be able to have like a strict mode. So if you only want to use the GQL variant of what's possible, you would only use that. Otherwise, you can just use whatever works. And probably that's going to be the case everywhere. It'll be for a while. Hopefully, it won't end up being quite as much of the mess. I apologize, but a mess as SQL is. It'll hopefully be a little bit more common, like the common set of what's possible in the language will be true across all vendors, rather than a very small subset and lots of differentiation across vendors, which is kind of the case a little bit in SQL.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, it'll be a little bit better in the graph query language family, I guess I'll say for now. But we'll see how that plays out.
Well, we spent the last episode recapping the biggest graph event of the year, Nodes 2024. So that was a huge milestone, I guess, for Neo4j and highlight of the year, I would say, for 2024. I think that there was a lot of good content and some really exciting things going on. Just some of the intro sessions, the closeout sessions. We talked about the fireside chats and kind of the fun and engagement, as well as just informative chat session that was at the close of each region. So a lot of fun to be had for that. So the video playlist is out if you want to catch that. And then, of course, prep for next year. It will be back next year. So definitely check that out. Does anybody have any final thoughts on nodes before we just point to the previous episode?
No, other
awesome.
than you should, that you should totally check it out.
Yeah.
Lots of great insights. I know from 2023, I even throughout the year, 2024, I was still like occasionally checking out different sessions from 23 because there was just such a wide variety of stuff and just so much good content. And we're all busy, but sometimes it'd be like, oh wait, going to a certain event or going to be talking with someone and like, oh, there was a nodes talk on that thing. I'll go back and it's like, okay, perfect. There was actually someone who had done a session talk on exactly that subject matter.
Yeah, I do think it was interesting too. We mentioned this in the last episode, but how much the content had changed over the last year too. You saw that reflected in the nodes presentations and even just the submissions that we got.
Yeah. I mean, there was a whole track dedicated to kind of the changes too, right? But even then, it permeated to every track.
Yeah, for sure.
So cool. Yeah, definitely check out nodes if you haven't already. Speaking of events throughout 2024, does anyone else have memorable events that they had been to? For me, Google Next really stood out to me for a couple of reasons. It was at Google Next, I kind of went around and I had this mission of like, you know what, I'm gonna go meet all the other dev advocates working, the floor, and just kind of say hi and figure out if there was like any sort of future partnership things we could do. And since then, it's set off this sort of chain events of joint events that, at least I've been involved with for the whole rest of the year past that. And also just randomly, one of my childhood friends, she works at Google, and prior I hadn't really thought to like reach out to her, but during the conference when people were just kind of moving in and out, just accidentally ran into her and it was like, what are you doing here? And it's like, so it was great to catch up and just enjoy the sort of serendipitous encounters at in-person events that really I think came back in strength over 2024.
Yeah, I will say that from personal experience, I did a lot more traveling this year, which, part of that was, kind of personal life situation stabled out a little bit for me and allowed me to do that. And then part of it, I think, was just the amount of events coming back and really thriving this year was much, much greater. And so there were a couple of smaller events I actually attended this year that were new to me, at least. I saw a lot of friends and colleagues from other events cross over into those. And it was just really interesting to connect with the different audiences and reconnect with kind of a blend of other conference groups that were there. And so that was kind of a fun new thing to do for this year. And then, of course, hit all the major events that I always love and try to hit every year.
Yeah, I mean, the events, as my family will attest, I went to many events this year. They're actually happy I'm home right now. But what was interesting to me, to your point, Jen, is just the variety of environments that we were able to fall into. Everything from, I mean, in the early year, one of my favorites was Microsoft Fabric. I thought was a really great event for us because it was one where information architects, similar to data scientists, they get graph really easily. And so it was really interesting to be able to be in an environment that was so fertile for conversation of how it fits in really logically. But also I was at everything this year from Gov AI to I was at a smart environments conference in Montreal a couple of weeks ago. We did I can't even think of all the different things. MLOps and GenAI World was great. There were some really interesting conversations that came out of that about how graph fits into your MLOps scenario. I just found myself in really unique and disparate environments that were new. And I really enjoyed being able to bring that graph insight to these different types of communities to see where it was going to go. I feel like the sort of the scattering and the spread was a much wider area than it had been in the past. It was kind of the breadth of the events and not necessarily one in particular that was really interesting for me for this year.
That is one thing I think kind of pops up that I noticed this year throughout 2024 is graphs previously were very much a data thing. They were a
Mhm.
database. You kind of talked about it in data circles and database circles, and not really traditional enterprise events, but kind of more of the kind of straight uniform verticals, type of stuff. And I've seen this year with Gen AI graph cross outside of those data boundaries and really become accessible in, like you said, Allison, all of these different types of verticals, industries, data, life sciences. And we've been in those spaces before, but it hasn't been a huge draw like I really felt like it was this year.
I also found that I got invited to a lot more things than I necessarily had. Usually it's you send in your conference talk proposal and cross your fingers and, oh, will they pick me? Do they like me? And now it's like, hey, can you please come talk about this? Can you please come talk about that? So I think that's part of the reason why my year was so busy too, is there was a lot of invitations that was newer for me as well.
Yeah.
I love what you're all saying, like the Gen AI aspects, kind of, through all this stuff. Obviously, that's the theme of the year, and with that, two aspects. Okay, every place I spoke, whether it's a meetup or a conference, whatever the context was, if I'm talking about Gen AI, then it's going to be well received, or I'm going to be invited so that I can talk about Gen AI. I definitely experienced all that as well, and then I'll focus on one particular AI event, which was the AI Engineer World's Fair, middle of the summer. I want to say maybe it was August, something like that, right? And this is the conference that was kind of spun out of the blog post, actually, right? That Swix had, I think maybe it was a year ago, June or something. He had this blog post about the rise of the AI engineer. Swix is this podcaster. He's from Latent Space. He has he blogs as well, and he wrote this blog post about just observing that with stuff happening in Gen AI, that there's all these new skills that people have to have, that it's okay, obviously it's prompt engineering, but beyond prompt engineering, you're still gonna have to write a little bit of software. You're probably gonna have to do a little bit of ML ops. You're probably gonna have to do a little bit, like, the kind of mix of things is a new mix of things. And in retrospect, it's an obvious name, but he's like, okay, he coined it as like, okay, this is the AI engineer. This is his term, which is genius. And then he had this conference in the summertime, which was absolutely amazing. And if you're doing Gen AI stuff, I think it's probably, the place to go to. It's in San Francisco, and it was an amazing event. And for us, we had, through the first half of the year leading up to that, been, of course, talking about graphs and graph rag and how you do that, with Gen AI. And we had some idea, of course, because we've been getting invites and getting good response to our pitches for talks at conferences, that GraphRag has got some appeal. And then we hit that conference, and every workshop, every session, every talk that we gave was packed, and the place was packed anyway. But the thirst, the hunger, the desperation, no, just the interest, the level of interest that people had
Yeah.
in listening to what we had to share with them was gratifying and humbling, because you never really know until, you kind of hear it back from people. People are like, okay, tell us the thing that you're talking about, because we want to hear the thing. And I've always enjoyed giving talks. It was probably the most, I don't know, kind of, I felt accepted, and in a way that maybe it was beyond even like whatever has happened before. Like, there's always a level of like understanding amongst engineering. Like, okay, you hear what I'm saying, you understand the concepts, and that feels really good. But this was like a little bit beyond that because it was such new frontier that we're charting, and people were like, "Yeah, we like where you're headed with this stuff." So that was certainly for event-wise the highlight for me.
Just
kind
a
of
quick follow-up on that. Oh, sorry. Go
Oh.
ahead, Jason.
Okay, so just real quick, so kind of like off of that, like in my walks of talking to other vendors at conferences and just people in general, it's amazing now, like ever since AI Engineers Fair, they're always bringing up the fact like people keep asking me about GraphRag, right? And this is from other vendors at other booths, other technologies that make sense for us to kind of like work with in the future. But in talking with them, it was always interesting how many had mentioned like, yeah, everyone keeps walking up to me asking like, do we support GraphRag, or do we have a future integration with some sort of GraphRag system? And so that's really just come up a ton, especially in the second half of this year. So yeah, Allison.
Oh, I was going to say AI Engineer World's Fair was certainly a moment. And I think the next big moment was at the AI conference in September. That was another one where I feel like the GraphRag story was, again, really relevant and really present. Our CTO, Philip, gave a talk the first day about the overview of it. And I mean, that room was huge. What was the capacity in that room? It was like hundreds and hundreds. I mean, it must have been like 600 people in that room. I don't even know. It was huge. And then I did the practical sort of getting started the next day, and it was still really busy. It was still really packed. And our booth was flooded afterwards because, again, at that point, the GraphRag story had really gotten its hooks into people. People knew that their RAG applications needed to evolve. And when we think about it from this business perspective, yeah, building chatbots is great, but where's the ROI? Where's the business impact? Where's the, how is this moving the company forward? And the GraphRag element really drives that home in a way that I don't know that people understood right away what that business impact and that ROI was going to be when you can bring in that context. Right. So I think that was the other really big shift, was not only the awareness of GraphRag, but the monetary value of implementing GraphRag over just like, oh, let's talk to our documents.
Segueing, I think, from events into maybe just what all happened at Neo4j this year. So what were kind of the new things, the latest and greatest that Neo4j was able to provide to the space this year in product releases?
I can speak to like a few of the Python updates, right? So we released a Python Rust extension, which dramatically improves or speeds up the query response time for a number of things. So the speed up varies depending on your data set and what type of questions you're asking, but anywhere from 3 to 10 times faster. If you're still using the original Neo4j Python bolt package, definitely look into adding the Rust extension, which automatically will pull in the original as well too, I believe. And it's just a drop-in replacement. So you don't have to change I don't think you even have to change your import statement if I remember right. But you definitely don't have to change any of the API calls, right? You just basically pull down that dependency and you get that automatic speed improvement.
That's awesome.
Yeah, right? And the next thing is we released the Neo4j GraphRag Python package fairly recently. So this provides a couple APIs that kind of abstract some complexities of generating a knowledge graph building pipeline. So you can run it in just basically a few lines of code. You can run this process, and it includes retrievers to work with a number of vector data stores, right? If you're already using, I believe the 3 that are supported are Weaviate, Pinecone, and Quadrant. So if you're already using or plan on using one of those vector stores, you can set that as a retriever with the GraphRag package. So what that will do is it will use one of those vector stores for storing the vector embedding, but all the graph related content goes to Neo4j. So through this one package, you're using actually 2 different data stores to make use of the strengths of both systems. So yeah, definitely check that out if you're a Python developer looking into implementing GraphRag pipelines.
One thing Neo4j, oh, sorry.
Nope, go for it.
Again, data scientist. One of the other things that I thought was really interesting this year was GDS on top of Snowflake and being able to actually use that relational. I mean, Snowflake is, everywhere, but having folks be able to actually access graph data science algorithms on top of relational, I thought was another really great thing to share the graph story, that there are certain algorithms that only run on graph and really highlight those relationships. And so I think as a starting point for people, it's been a really interesting way to sort of show the power of graph and show the power of those algorithms from something that's obviously very relational.
Allison, would you mind for a non-data scientist expanding on that a little bit? Like, so is it GDS running somewhere separately? Is it GDS in a Snowflake environment? Like, what's the setup actually like?
Yeah, can I answer that question accurately? My understanding, and I've only just started working with it, so I apologize. Like, we'll get you, I'll get you some more detailed answers. But basically, for anyone who's familiar with GDS, and Jen, I know you were just talking about this recently. What is a projection? So the idea is that you take what's in the relational database and it projects a graph that you can run the algorithms on, but it's not an actual Neo4j database instance. It's a projection into the GDS space that then you can, a lot of times what folks will use that for is creating new features in traditional machine learning algorithms. So is it that, a page rank could be an important predictor of, I don't know, like product popularity, or how can we like use it for different types of recommendation engines, or there's lots of different ways that it can be used. So it kind of depends on what your use case is, but think about if you had the opportunity to run graph algorithms and then retain that for whatever that use case may be without necessarily starting again. I would prefer that you have the actual database, but I think it's a really, we talk a lot about how can we, show the power of graph? How can we show people what's possible and what can you understand about your data when you look at it in this connected way? And so I think it's just a really interesting way for folks who may not be graphistas to start to think about how you can leverage graph in new ways.
Yeah. I love this because as a computer scientist, like there's always somewhat of a question of like, do you bring your data to the thing that's doing the processing, or do you take your processing to the thing that's has the data, right? And like, okay, Snowflake's big and unwieldy. You're not going to jam all that over into like, I mean, you could compress that all and like put that into a graph, I suppose, but you probably don't want that. Like, because as you're saying, like the utility here of GDS is to do the algos. And so, okay, you bring the compute, which is GDS, over to Snowflake, project from Snowflake into that environment a graph, run the algos, and then I guess save results back to Snowflake.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Or use them in an application. Like, what you do with that is open, right? So is it that it's something that sits on top of it and gets projected into an application? Is it something that gets put back? There's any number of ways that you can leverage that. But, that happens a lot. I know people say to us, well, do I have to put everything into Neo4j to actually get utility out of this? How do we do that? And my recommendation is always to sort of start small. And I think this is an interesting way to start small, because graphs are certainly inevitable, but.
And I think it's a big ask too. Data is a lot, and putting something into a database, no matter what that database happens to look like, includes a lot of design work, a lot of, requirements work and sign-offs and all that kind of stuff. And depending on your organization, looking at something new or saying, "Hey, we need to rip and replace," is just not feasible. So I think meeting developers where they are and providing some of these capabilities while still realizing that it's not practical to rip and replace every time. So providing these capabilities, and then as they maybe gain benefit or as they continue to use, that tipping point shifts, and then it may become feasible or even necessary to switch and move to different technologies or different tools. So I think it just gives an opportunity to say, hey, here's your situation. There's no need to change that. But let's kind of see if we can add to this and see if we can provide additional value, knowing that, you can't just rip and replace on a whim and risk these new situations that are huge for businesses.
Maybe that's the other catchphrase for graphs for next year. We'll have graphs are inevitable, and graphs are a yes and. They're not right. It's not no but graphs. It's
100%.
yes and graphs.
Yeah, which has really been a great part of this whole like retrieval augmented generation story, right? With vector, right? It's, I think at first like, okay, it's vector is a completely different thing, but it's like, oh wait, no, you can do both, right? Which is, I think, also like one of the great learnings of this year was like, oh yeah, they do work better together. And so now we've got this great, working together story with many other vendors and not be this, oh, you gotta choose one database or the other. It's like, oh, you know what? You should use all the databases.
There's a reason each of these technologies emerged, and that's because something or the existing technology space did not provide the capabilities they needed. And so therefore you create this new tool, this new technology, this new data store in order to fill that gap. And that doesn't mean that there are no other gaps and that database solves them all. It just means that depending on what you're doing, you'll have different gaps for that, and different technologies and tools will fill those very unique gaps.
Totally agree.
Yeah, totally. Should we jump into tools of the year, tools of the month?
Yeah. Let's
Oh
do it.
no,
We lost
what happened to Allison?
Allison's
Bring
going
her
to have
back.
to
I'm
research.
Oh, there you are.
are.
You just
Back.
wanted to
I was
shift
lagging.
panels.
I had to switch over. Well, I was lagging, so I had to shift over the internet.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. I think we're
Sorry,
all lagging
words.
to some degree, which is why I'm kind of like, should I pause longer, talk sooner, I don't know, talk later?
Yeah.
So it's all worked out. But okay, yes, yeah. So yeah, tools of the month and maybe tools of the year. That might as well. We're doing that.
Ooh,
wow.
tools of the year.
Right. Okay, I guess I'll start with my tool of the month. So BAML from Boundary, which is a technology that Ben Lorica mentioned during his keynote. So the easiest way to describe BAML is kind of like a framework or tooling to get structured output from unstructured input. So basically a BAML file consists of basically two components. One is the data model, which is very, very similar to Pydantic in Python. So you have these very strict models, strict-ish. I mean, you can give it some flexibility. And then the functions that define the prompt engineering, the prompts that you want to run. And that's it for the BAML files. Once you've got the BAML file ready, what you can do is make a function call to those prompt engineering functions that you defined in the BAML file, and it will construct output based on the Pydantic-like models that you had specified. So for a demo with them a couple of weeks ago, what I did was I just took their Fast API demo, which Fast API is for quickly creating Python servers. And so this endpoint, I would just give it a URL of a web page that had agenda items. So I used our nodes agenda to test with. And so the underlying LLM that you choose, in this case, I was using OpenAI, would then look at the page, kind of parse it through, and look for data that match that data model. In the prompt engineering, all I said was like, you are pulling out event information and just returning that. And so it would go through and would find, the speakers, events, and all the stuff that I had modeled. And it will only give you output that matches that with the data filled, whether it's required or optional. So you do not get, like when you ask other LLM RAG systems, you sometimes get a JSON output that you expect. Sometimes you get like a list. Sometimes you get like text, right? There's always this prompt engineering foo you have to do to try to force it to give you the data you want. But BAML has created a internal workflow that strictly only outputs what you're looking for. It either gives it to you or it gives you nothing, right? So if you're asking for like a list of these objects, it'll give you an empty list if it doesn't match, or it'll give you the items that it finds. And it's quite quick. And once you wrap your head that you have to create this data model portion, then it all ingests very, very, very quickly, very easily. So it offers that intermediary step that like, so our LLM graph builder, right? You give an input and then you kind of get the output right away, more or less. BAML offers that intermediary where you can define the exact output and kind of control that layer. So anyways, that was super long, but that's my tool of the month. Anyone else got a favorite tool of the month or year?
I love to BAML. Like I've heard about this a couple of times now. Ben has mentioned it, Ben Lorica, and it seems really intriguing to me. And what I've understood about part of the magic, I'm just going to riff off that for a second. I apologize, but that they've realized that, like as you said, like part of the challenge is the prompt engineering, but then also basically what amounts to post processing. And it sounded like they basically attacked that part of it. They're like, hey, whatever we get back from the LLM, we know that it's tried to give back useful information that matches what we've asked for, and that they have some post processing that they do. That they're like, okay, we have a target defined by the schema. We're going to go ahead and try to fill that schema with what we've been given, and so that's the kind of extra bit of work that's in the BAML. So it's the specification, then the post processing. That from what I've heard, they just do such a good job with that you can use smaller models or more specific models and get equal or better results than you would have with a large model. So it's not, it's nice to set up, it's nice to work with, does good, gets good results, and takes a lot of the heavy lifting out of the scene, which I love. I'm going to +1 BAML, first of all, like even though I haven't even used it yet, like if it's as good as advertised, I'm kind of pre-sold on it, I guess I would say. And maybe this isn't a tool of the year, but like the tool of the month, I guess, for me. And I'm a bit late to this party, so I apologize for folks who are already there. I've only recently started using Notebook LM. I'm like, okay, this is great. This is the kind of way I'd like to work with. Like having chats with ChatGPT, like at some point is just annoying. I'm scrolling up and down all the time and copying from here. I'm like, yeah, I just want to be able to save snippets of stuff, ask it to do bits of work, and then use that for ultimately assembling some kind of output of result. And because I happen to live in a Google Docs connected world, the integration with YouTube videos and Google Docs and everything else is so pleasant. It's like, okay, this is great. This makes me very happy. All my stuff is there and I can just do work with it. So that's my tool of the month. It's consumer level, not as engineering-y as yours, Jason, but that's where I'm at right now.
Nice.
Okay,
I'm going to
I'll do
follow
mine
up on that one with, sorry.
Nope, go for it.
ChatGPT 4.0 Canvas. Can we just talk about Canvas? Love Canvas. That's probably my tool of the year. I love Canvas. So for those of you who don't know, basically you have your ChatGPT 4.0, but it creates sort of canvases, which are like subdocs. So I use it a lot if I'm working on coding, like, oh, can you update this piece, update that piece? Or maybe I want sort of an overview document, but then I need something that's longer and more detailed. I can work on those simultaneously within the different canvases within the chat. I've used that a lot this year. That's probably one of my tools of the year. Again, not super technical, but it's been a great tool for me. My tool of the month, actually, I just heard about yesterday, and it's sort of what I'm most curious about right now from Anthropic, the Model Context Protocol. Has anybody heard about this? What they're trying to do is, I know, it's super exciting. It's super exciting. So basically what it's trying to do is give you a way to talk to a variety of, your different APIs or different connectors to bring data back for context. What I'm playing with right now, again, like just came out, is pulling in something from like a Postgres, and then putting that into Graph. So having, those multiple databases live next to each other, and then being able to run sort of the graph rag on what's been pulled out, the combination of those. That's sort of what I'm playing with right now. And I'm really curious to see where that goes and if it, gains roots. But yeah, the Model Context Protocol from Anthropic, I'm super curious about.
I'm going to Google that straight away.
Okay, my tool of the month isn't necessarily a tool of the month, I guess. It's a really tiny, small thing. But one thing I really wanted to call out is that I got a notice in my email that GitHub Actions was deprecating version 3 and moving to version 4, which means that anytime you're doing an upload artifact or download artifact, you're like, it shuts off December 5th. So it's done. You have to migrate to the new thing. And the backbone of my website is using GitHub Actions. So I'm like, well, I need to go out. And this is usually, I always tease every year that there's one big thing on my website that should be like a 5-minute fix. And it always ends up taking like a week because of all the things that, break or other things I didn't realize or have to fix or test or, that sort of stuff. But this V3 to V4 for GitHub Actions was seamless on the upgrade. I went in, I fixed a version in my YAML file, I pushed it to GitHub, and it built. And it's success. And I went out and I tested my website. Everything was there. Like, it worked. It was just the simplest user experience ever. And I don't know what they did or
Yay,
what all work.
GitHub.
Yes,
Yeah,
what all work
that-
they put into that. But to have that kind of user experience for an upgrade, and especially like a deprecation upgrade, was phenomenal to me. And as you said, Jason, the Rust package, where there's nothing that breaks when you add this dependency, that's just all you need in order to take on those benefits. I wish more developers and more tools and more products would do that sort of seamless experience, where it's just so easy to just drop it in and use it right out of the gate.
That's the way it should be, right?
Yeah.
That's
So
amazing.
that's probably my tool of the month. I will say that over the course of this year, and of course, all of you are probably going to be like, oh, here she goes again with, Spring. But the Spring AI project has made some major strides this year. And I'm just always impressed at the amount of work and the involvement on the Spring and the Neo4j side of things to kind of move that project along and to incorporate user feedback. There's been a lot of things that I've brought up that it's like, hey, this doesn't make sense, or hey, this seems to be missing. And it's just like, okay, we'll put it in for you. And or, here's the thing you can, put it together and submit a pull request. And so it's just a really engaging, thriving community there. Spring AI is not GA released yet, so that's kind of a hindrance there, maybe to some, but it is a really interesting, fun way to incorporate AI into Spring projects, and just a really engaging, fun project to be involved with.
Nice.
And much respect to Spring. I think you're totally right. Like, for a project that is as long running as it is so high quality, great people, great community, and don't need the latest, greatest, let's write from scratch an entirely new thing. No, let's just keep adding on and adjusting, and it's amazing. Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any upcoming things that all of us advocates will be involved in, events and things? I know for me, as far as presentations and conferences, I will be doing a Java user group tour in Florida, USA, just after the new year. So that's really my only thing kind of upcoming.
I have some events for January. By the time we release this episode, they should be on the calendar, but we do some joint events in San Francisco with Weaviate, Diffbot, and a couple other companies. So yeah, looking forward to that at end of January.
My diary for January is open right now. I haven't committed to anything. I have some options that I have not followed through on yet. But in December, so we're recording this in November, so like in December 12th, there'll be my last event for the year is Connected Data London, which is a knowledge graph intensive kind of environment. Really looking forward to that. That should be pretty great. And then I do expect Q1 next year to just quickly fill up. I think it looks like it's an open calendar right now. I know that's not actually true once January hits.
Yep, too true. Allison?
I am happy to report that I do not have any live events on my calendar for January. Most people who follow me know I have literally been in, I feel like, many time zones this year, and was fortunate enough to connect with so many people around the globe. So in January, I'm going to be detoxing from travel, but really looking forward to setting up my calendar for next year. So you may not see me in January, but you will likely see me very shortly after that.
Sounds great. And as always, we'll include in the show notes all of the current articles, videos, and events that are going on that are sitting on calendars and in spaces where you can hopefully will point you to them. But we hope you have a wonderful close to your 2024 and beginning of 2025. Thanks all, and talk to you again soon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Happy 2025.